3 rings for elven kings under the sky, 7 for dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where shadows lie. Excuse me. We're reporting to you live from the land of Mordor, where Frodo and Sam are attempting to destroy the One Ring. We'll check back on them in a few moments. In the meantime, we have to pick up our discussion on Beowulf, which actually is pretty appropriate considering J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, absolutely loved Beowulf, and it influenced his work. So, for us, we're going to lean on our discussion of Beowulf to learn about the time period he wrote in. We are now in the early Middle Ages, the age of the Germanic kingdoms, the conversion of the Germanic tribes, and the rise of monasticism. Stay tuned for an exciting trip through the early Middle Ages in the land of Mordor, which actually had a lot in common. The early Middle Ages are known as the Dark Ages, this time period after the fall of Rome, where it seemed that civilization had been destroyed, perhaps for good. Remember, Rome had lasted 1,000 years. Rome was called the Eternal City. The thought of Rome falling was unthinkable. Rome had survived everything. It had survived attempted invasions. It had survived wars. It had survived a massive plague in the 3rd century that wiped out 33% of the population, and Rome had still stood. And now in the year 500 AD, Rome is gone. And with Rome gone, there are 3 major players on the scene. The Byzantine Empire in the east, founded in a sense by Justinian, not that he started it, but he was its greatest leader and made it a power again. So the Byzantine Empire was strong, rich, and politically powerful. On the other hand, there was the new rising Islamic Empire. The forces of Islam had struck out across the Mediterranean world and within a very short time conquered 2/3 of what had been Christendom. So you have 2 large, powerful, and promising civilizations, the Byzantines and the Muslims. There's a 3rd civilization, Western Europe, but the West had fallen. Now, if you were betting on one of those 3 civilizations to come and take over the world, who would you have bet on? Most people would have bet on the Byzantines, or perhaps the Muslims. No one would have bet on Western Europe, which was going through what some historians would call a dark age. And for hundreds of years it went through a dark age. And yet that's not what happened. Through some accident of history or series of accidents, it was Western European civilization that came to dominate the world. And what's more, that formed the foundations for the modern world. So we are now in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. And what we're studying is the development of a new Western civilization that was a mix of 3 cultures. It was a mix of the fallen Roman culture, it was a mix of Christianity, and it was a mix of the Germans. And it's those 3 things forming a sort of melting pot: German culture, you looked at this in Beowulf, Roman culture, and Christianity that form the culture of the Middle Ages and the basis for our culture today in ways that you do not now appreciate, but hopefully will by the end of this course. So the first thing to look at is German warrior culture. One of the things we noticed in Beowulf is that there's a certain pessimism in Beowulf. J.R.R. Tolkien himself commented on this. He said, in Beowulf, yes, you have this great epic hero, but what is the German world? The Germans are living in a world surrounded by monsters. There are monsters everywhere. You kill one monster, another one shows up. You kill Grendel, his mother shows up, hell-bent on vengeance. You kill his mother, a dragon shows up. There's a lake of monsters. The Germans lived in a world where there were monsters everywhere. And here's the thing. In the end, the monsters were going to win. If you know anything about the myth of Ragnarok, you know how this works. If not, you should go online to Overly Sarcastic Productions and you will watch the myth of Ragnarok. So Ragnarok was the Norse myth of the end of the world. No, not the, Avengers, Thor, Christian Hemsworth, whoever he was, version of Ragnarok, which was great. But that's not the Norse myth of Ragnarok. The Norse myth of Ragnarok is literally the end of the world for the Norse. There was this eternal battle going on between the gods and the giants and the monsters. And the gods were going to lose in the end. There was always another monster to fight. Thor could do amazing deeds, but in the end, he was going to die. And the Norse world was going to be destroyed. Well, in a sense, this is the world of Beowulf. The world where, yes, Beowulf can do heroic feats, but in the end, he dies. There's no happy ending there. He gets to look at the treasure one last time, and then that's it. So you have to appreciate that this is the world the Germans lived in. A world where there's a certain pessimism, a sense that they are going to lose in the end, that even the gods would lose in the end. And here's the thing. If you live in a world surrounded by monsters, you're always going to be fighting. And so this is the first aspect of German culture we want to appreciate. We want to appreciate the German warrior culture. You saw this all through Beowulf. Warrior culture values certain things. What did Beowulf value? Courage, boastfulness. Beowulf was a bragger. He was an attention seeker. But it was okay because he could back it up. So German warrior cultures did not value modesty or humility. There's no taking a compliment. There's no, yeah, sure, I did great, but whatever. No, there was no point being great unless everyone knew how great you were, much like Greek culture in some ways. So German warrior culture values most of all fighting skill. It values courage. Now, the way German warrior culture worked, and by German warrior culture, we're talking about groups like the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, the Angles, the Saxons, the groups that invaded the Roman Empire. These are the guys we're looking at. And so what we're going to do is look at them and then look at what happens when they become Christian, when they mix with Roman culture. And the way this normally worked is you would have small bands of warriors, again, like Beowulf and his band. They'd be led by a chieftain. If you remember Tacitus called him a king, but it was really more of a chieftain than a king. And they would go on battle after battle, seeking what Beowulf wanted: treasure, plunder. So it was kind of a hit and run style of fighting that was determined to get treasure. And the point of treasure was glory. Again, what was treasure to Beowulf? Treasure was recognizing that he was a great ruler. So a successful chieftain, or king if we want to use that word, as long as we understand that they're kind of kings of a very small number of people, a successful chieftain had to win a lot. He had to lead from the front and be a great fighter. He had to be a great fighter because as a great fighter, he had to be able to convince people to follow him. You only wanted to follow someone who was a great fighter. He had to be a great fighter for another reason. He had to be able to reward his followers with gifts. Hrothgar in Beowulf had been a great fighter. It talks about how his kin and other people flocked to his banner and he decided to build a mead hall. What's Hrothgar's main job in Beowulf? In Beowulf, Hrothgar's main job is to give presents. And so a good king is a good gift giver. This is what we would call a gift culture. To the Germans, their gold was not to buy things with. It's not like we would get that gold, we would want to go out and buy something with it. That's not what it was for the Germans. For the Germans, that gold was a present. It established a personal tie, a personal relationship between two men, between the chieftain who gave out the gold and between the warriors who took the gold. And that meant they had a responsibility. Yes, the chieftain, the leader, had a duty to fight in front and to reward his followers. But his followers, by taking that gold, had a duty to back the leader. This is why at the end of Beowulf, when he fights the dragon and only one warrior, Wiglaf, backs him, this is why the others who went out were in such disgrace. Wiglaf reminds them, he reminds himself, when he's trying to psych himself up to go help Beowulf out, Wiglaf reminds himself that, all right, we made the promise to Beowulf in the mead hall when he gave us gift. Now we have to keep our end of the bargain. So that was important to them. It was a warrior culture. It was a culture of gift giving. Those gifts established a relationship. It was a culture led by kings. And a good king had to be a good fighter so he could win loot, so he could use that loot to reward his followers. That's a Germanic system. Now, there are a couple other things worth looking at. One of them is the Germanic concept of justice. Our justice system today is very different than the German justice system. Our justice system is you do something wrong, the police arrest you, they haul you into court. You don't answer to the person you hurt, you answer to the government. Someone breaks into my car, I can't just go kill him. I call the police arrest him, the police haul him into court, and he answers to the judge. That's not the way things worked in German culture. In German culture, this would have seemed crazy. They would have said, this guy, you hurt so-and-so, you broke into his car, why are you answering to some judge? You should answer to the person you hurt. So justice in German culture was not public. There was no official government to make up for wrongs. Justice was between individuals. You hurt me, you owe me. I hurt you, I better be afraid that you're coming for me. And so this is the way the justice system worked. You have a reading on this that we're going to look at. It talks about the different penalties you had to pay. Now, if your crime was not a very serious one, you might pay a fine to the person you hurt. Again, not how things work today. Now, for a not serious crime, you would pay a fine to the government. You run through a red light, you pay a fine to the government. Well, now, German culture, if you do something not too serious, you might pay a fine to the person you've harmed. Reasonable. What if you do something more serious? Well, you might have to pay with your life. This is what's called weregild. Weregild. This is if you killed a man, this was the penalty for it. So if you killed somebody, you had a high price to pay, and you better hope that price was high enough that his family wouldn't come hunting for you. Because remember, German culture is a very family-centered culture. You kill somebody from my family and I, we're coming after you, and then it turns into a revenge cycle, much like the Lion King. Now, you would have to be able to prove that a person was guilty because you didn't want this to turn into too much a revenge cycle that ends up with a lot of dead people. So there were different ways you could prove guilt or innocence. For something not too serious, you could prove guilt or innocence by something called compurgation. Compurgation is the idea of taking an oath. So suppose I'm charged with killing somebody else's cattle. Not actually killing him, just killing his cattle. I stole his cattle, I stole his sheep, something like that. And I'm charged with this. Well, okay, I get a chance to prove that I'm innocent, of course. And so for something less serious, me proving my innocence could be me getting a bunch of my family members to come and swear, oh, I know him. He would never do something like that. And they would all have to take that oath. Which makes sense because remember, Germanic culture was a family culture. It was a kinship-oriented culture. So you had to know that your kin were going to back you. And if you could get enough of your kin to take an oath that, oh no, he's not this kind of person, he didn't do that, he was with us at the time, then you would not be charged. You would essentially get off free. If you couldn't get enough people to swear for you, that's a problem. Again, remember the importance of kin-family relationships in early German culture. What if it was something more serious? What if you were charged with killing somebody? Well, then there was something called trial by ordeal. You know what this looks like. You're familiar with the idea from the Salem witch trials or the witch hunts. You throw someone into a pond and see if she floats. If she floats, she's a witch. If she sinks, well, she's not a witch. In either way, she's dead. But hey, at least you know if she's guilty or not. So trial by ordeal could look a lot different. One simple form of the trial by ordeal, again, this could be for things that were not too serious, would be the person who was accused had to be able to perhaps say the Our Father without hesitating or slipping up. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. If you could do that straight through without slipping up, then you would be found not guilty. If you stuttered or stumbled or forgot a phrase, then you would be assumed to be guilty. There's something slightly logical about this, as much as it seems kind of superstitious. The superstitious part was thinking that, well, you see, obviously if you're guilty, God would trip you up. So in a sense, a trial by ordeal was an appeal to God's judgment. They didn't have forensic science. They didn't have CSI. They needed a way to know if a person was really guilty of something really serious. So they said, well, what's the surest thing in the world? God's judgment is the surest thing in the world. Okay, say the Our Father. If you're guilty, God won't let you say it straight through. You'll mess up. God will make sure of that. So it seems a little superstitious, but there's an element in which it's not. And the way it's not is, well, if you're guilty, you're probably nervous. If you're nervous, you're more likely to slip up. There are other cultures that have something like similar too. I remember reading there was a time period in some Japanese or Chinese culture, I forget which, when to test if a person was guilty or not, you would put dry rice in their mouth and try to have them speak. And if they could, they were innocent. If they couldn't, they were guilty. Seems crazy, but the idea is if you're guilty, you're going to be nervous. Your mouth will be dry. You'll find it harder to speak. You'll choke on the rice. If you're not guilty, you won't be as nervous. Your mouth will be, you'll have enough spit, saliva. You'll be able to talk. So again, it makes some sense. Now, again, that would be for a not too serious crime. For a serious crime, you might have trial by hot iron. Not a lot of fun. In a trial by hot iron, it's what it sounds like. You would have to take a boiling hot iron. This iron bar would have been heated in a flame. You would have to grasp it in your hands, holding it firmly, and it's red hot at this point, so it's burning your hand in a horrible way. And you would have to walk or run a certain distance. You would then put it down, and of course, your hand would be horribly maimed at this point. You would have it wrapped up, and then 3 days later, they would check on it. If it was healing okay, they would say, okay, God has clearly shown that you are not guilty. If your hand was festering and looked infected, God has decided not to heal you. You must be guilty. Again, very different from our way of doing things. They didn't have CSI, so in the absence of that, they needed to determine guilt or innocence in a way they thought was likely. That took the form of an appeal to God's judgment. And of course, there are the forms we're familiar with, where you throw a woman accused of witchcraft. So not just for that, but it becomes used for witchcraft. You throw her into water. If she floats, well, she's guilty. Because what happened is the earth rejected her. The earth threw her up. If she's innocent, well, the earth accepted her. So she will sink down to the bottom of the water. And if she's really lucky, they might decide to haul her up in time. But if not, the important thing was her reputation was safe. Because remember, again, in German culture, reputation is what matters. It matters to Beowulf. So you see even that there. And of course, last thing about German culture, it tended to be polytheistic. We know about Norse mythology, the idea of gods like Thor, Odin, Loki, and all those fun myths. A lot of people think they're even more fun than Greek mythology. Probably a lot of truth to that. So this is the background to the German culture. We're going to look at one of the main German cultures, the Franks. The Franks were one of these tribes that conquered Rome. Just one of many, but we're going to pick them as the one to focus on because, like the name suggests, they're the ones who end up founding France. It's not France at the time, but in a few hundred years it will be. So one of these chieftains, Clovis, has a lot of success in war. As he gets more successful in war, he gets more loot, he gives it to more people, he attracts more followers. Eventually, Clovis becomes so successful, he's able to declare himself king. King of the Franks. Remember that. He does not call himself king of France. France is a place. Now, as far as the Germans were concerned, why would you want to be king of a place? Why would you want to be king of grass, of rocks? That's stupid. You're not the king of land. You're the king of people. So he is king of the Franks. It's actually going to be, and this is how things are for hundreds of years, the idea of what we would think of today as ruler of a place is silly. You are, to a German, you are the ruler of a people. Clovis was a skilled ruler of his people. He allied with his nobles. He kept good relationships with his nobles. He even managed to keep good relationship with the Catholic Church, which is kind of a big deal in this time period. He doesn't stay in one place. He moves around his kingdom because as a king, you need to be seen. You sit in one palace and stay still all the time. No one's going to listen to you. No one's going to care. Now, Clovis is an interesting test case because he is a classic German warrior like Beowulf, right? He wants glory, he wants gold, he worships his gods. His gods are great. They don't tell him to do anything. It's a good system. And yet Clovis is an example of one of these German warriors who gradually, very slowly, but gradually converts to Christianity. Now, at first, he has no interest whatsoever in conversion. You can imagine why not. He's a macho German warrior. I mean, Christianity, well, I mean, there are things in the Bible that seem kind of wussy. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. Again, blessed are the poor. What? No, blessed are the rich. Blessed are people with lots of treasure. Wait, blessed the peacemakers. It's in the Bible too. Blessed are the peacemakers. What kind of nonsense is this? At least that's how Clovis would have seen it. So you can understand Clovis not really being interested in Christianity. Christianity seems like a wimpy religion for women and old people. Not a religion for manly German warriors, which Clovis definitely wanted to be. But Clovis's wife was a Christian, and his wife really put a lot of effort into convincing Clovis to convert. I mean, her nagging of him is just tremendously pushy and fascinating and really hilarious to read. Like, she insults his gods daily. She calls his gods weak, made up, they're wimps, they can't do anything, they're committing all sorts of crimes. You're worshiping, I mean, think about all the horrible things Zeus did. Like, she accuses his god, your gods are sleeping with their own sisters, they're having all kinds of affairs. Are those the kind of gods you're worshiping? That's weak. And she keeps up at this over and over and over, like pushing and pushing her husband to convert. And, you know, he doesn't listen for a long time. He's not interested. But eventually he has, well, an experience. If you remember Constantine, remember way back to Constantine in the year, I don't know, 310? In the early 4th century AD, Constantine is fighting to become emperor. Well, he has a vision in the heavens. He sees a cross, and with the writing, in this sign you will conquer. And he places the cross on his uniform, on his soldiers, on their shields. He goes forth into battle, he conquers, and he legalizes Christianity. Clovis has something similar happen. He's in battle, good German warrior, he has to battle, and it's not really going well. And it really seems like his gods are ignoring him, and he's getting a little desperate. And while he's getting desperate, he thinks about what his wife was saying. And he says, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. And so he prays to Jesus. Says, I have called upon my gods and they have failed me. You, Jesus Christ, help me and I will believe in you and be baptized. Well, he does this, the tide of the battle turns, Clovis wins the battle, he becomes a Christian, and all his people, or at least a lot of them, become baptized with him. Suggests a lot about Clovis. First of all, it suggests how he saw Christianity. Jesus was there to help him win a battle. It doesn't mean he read the whole Bible and believed everything in it overnight. And so this tells us something that you saw in Beowulf. It tells us that conversion was a slow, gradual process. Because Clovis didn't become a Christian overnight. The people in Beowulf weren't Christians. It's like they had heard of Christianity, but were only starting to learn about it. And so conversion is a gradual process. See, conversion happens in two stages. The first stage, which happened when Clovis was baptized, the initial conversion. You get baptized, you say, I'm a Christian, voila, you're a Christian. But that doesn't mean he gave up the rest of his warrior culture. That doesn't mean he believes in all the other details of Christianity. So there's the initial or first conversion, and then there's the deeper conversion. And that deeper conversion takes hundreds of years. And it takes a long time to get these German warriors to convert. Even when Clovis goes, it doesn't mean every other German warrior magically becomes a Christian overnight. And so it's a process. It takes time to make it happen. And so what you have are Christian missionaries, preachers, going to these German warriors trying to convert them. They're clearly here to stay. It's not like Rome is going to rise again and throw them out. So the goal of the church is to convert these German warriors to Christianity and hope you can maybe make them a little less violent in the process. Maybe. Well, there are three methods of conversion. One of these methods is persuasion. So this is kind of what happens with Clovis. Clovis's wife pushes him and pushes him and pushes him. And eventually he says, fine, you know what? I'll try anything. And he converts. There's another famous example of persuasion, actually, when a group of Christian missionaries are traveling in the north of France or Germany. And they come across a village, a pagan village, and they try to convert the people to Christianity. People laugh at them. We're not going to do that. This is our sacred tree. This tree is sacred to our God. We honor it. It gives us all the protection we need. We don't need your Christianity. Take your Jesus out of here. Okay, the missionaries say, that's your sacred tree? Yes, that's our sacred tree. What would happen if we cut that tree down? The God would be very angry with us. We would be punished. You would be smitten with instant death. Really? Bet you we're not. So the Christian missionaries take their axes. They chop the tree down then and there. The Germans are cowering, expecting instant retribution from their gods, thunder and lightning to strike everybody, the tree being sacred to Thor, of course, and nothing happens. What? Where's the lightning? It didn't happen. And so what the Germans conclude is, oh, your God must be stronger than our God. And many of them convert. This would be an example of persuasion. All right. Persuasion works well. The problem is people can just say no. And that happens a lot. So, all right, are there any other options? Another option is, the second method of conversion is force. Try to force people to become Christians. Now, for the most part, that's not something the church can do. The Germans are trained warriors. The church doesn't have trained warriors, but there are exceptions. Charlemagne, later a king of the Franks, tries to force the entire Saxon people to convert to Christianity when he conquers them. It doesn't go well. Yes, he can try to force them to do it while he's there, saying, convert or I'll start killing you. But then he goes home, and the moment Charlemagne goes home, they convert back to their pagan religion. So Charlemagne has to go back to the Saxon territory, force them to convert again, and he's going back and forth for 26 years. Force is not really an effective means of conversion. All right, so persuasion can work, but people can say no. Force Well, you can't say no, but it's hard to make it stick. Is there another option? So the third option is maybe the most important one. It's called accommodation. Accommodation means you try to convert the Germans by relating Christianity to pagan beliefs. See, the gap between Christianity and German culture seems very, very large. German culture says loot and glory and warfare and battle, and there's no afterlife, and manly warrior culture. And then there's Christianity, which seems to say things like, blessed are the meek, the poor, the peacemakers, and things like that. This seems like a really big difference. Now, what accommodation does is it tries to close that difference, to make it seem like the difference between Christianity and German culture isn't that big. That way, it's not like a German has to leap from here to here to become a Christian. He's only leaping from here to here, which maybe seems a little more doable. So, take one basic example. Why do we have Christmas trees? We have Christmas trees because in German culture, it was common to have a sacred tree, a tree that was sacred to a god. The Christian missionaries say, oh, okay, you can still have your sacred trees, but now your trees, they're actually sacred to our God. And actually, your trees are symbols of Christmas, of new life, of our God coming into the world. They're symbols of eternal life because they're evergreen trees. They're green all year round. So your tree is actually symbol of the eternal life that you can now have because our God came into the world. So suddenly your pagan tree to the god Thor becomes a Christmas tree. In a related way, in England, St. Ambrose is famous as a missionary to England. And when he gets to England, he sees a lot of pagan shrines. And at these shrines, the Germans, the Anglo-Saxons, would gather once a year, or however often they did, and they would have wild parties, they'd make sacrifices, they'd worship their gods, they'd have a great time, and then they'd go home. Well, Ambrose is like, I need to figure out something to do about this. You know, these shrines are a problem. What should I do? And he writes to the Pope asking for advice. Says, should I just destroy them? The Pope writes back, no, bad move. That'll just set them off. Here's what you do. Oh, Ambrose says, okay, that's a good idea. So the next year, when the Anglo-Saxons come to those shrines, and the Anglo-Saxons expect to carry on their partying and their feasting, and with these pagan shrines, they find that all their pagan statues are gone, and in their place are crosses and symbols of Christianity. So they can still have their parties and their celebrations. Now they're just doing it in the Christian way. Now they're just doing it and they're worshiping Christian gods. That's an example of accommodation, of trying to take Christian beliefs and practices and relate them to Christianity, to try to close that gap between German culture and Christianity, and to make it easier for a German to take that step. One of the most famous examples is Ireland, St. Patrick. So Patrick is known as this great apostle to Ireland. He's in this time period. Patrick died around the year 461. So again, we're right during the fall of the Roman Empire. His name was actually not, we know him as Patrick. It would have been in Latin Patricius, from the Latin word patrician. So Patrick was his name meant a nobleman. Well, Patrick had a bit of a rough start to his life in some ways, because at the age of 16, he was captured by pirates. Not Pirates of the Caribbean pirates, Irish pirates. Patricius lived in England, captured by Irish pirates, taken to Ireland to serve as a slave. And for 6 years, Patricius was a slave in Ireland before he finally escaped. Now you'd think most people would say, okay, I got away from there, I'm never going back. But Patrick says, all right, I got away from there. I think I'm going back. Patrick becomes a priest back in England. Then he becomes a bishop in the Catholic Church. But through all of this, he never forgets the Irish. And eventually he returned to Ireland as a missionary. And his impact on Ireland was tremendous. We tell stories about him, of course, driving the snakes from Ireland. Supposedly he used a 3-leaf clover to explain certain aspects of Christian belief. That's not the most important thing he did, though. The most important thing he did is he was the great apostle to the Irish to try to convert them to Christianity. And it's an example of using these techniques of conversion. Now, clearly, force is not an option for him. He has no armies. He returns mostly alone. So that's not an option. Really, he's got persuasion and he's got accommodation. All right. Now, he has something going for him. Because while he had been a slave for 6 years in Ireland, he had gotten to know the Irish people. He had gotten to know the Irish gods. And what's so extraordinary about him is he got to like them, even though they were holding him captive as a slave. And that's why he can't really forget them, and he goes back there. Now, one of the things Patrick learned about the Irish is their gods weren't very nice. Their gods were harsher, bloodier than the gods of Olympus. In a sense, their gods were almost like the monsters of the world of Beowulf. The idea is they were always there, tricking you, sneaking you, setting a trap for you. And you, in the end, they were going to get you. Their gods were the kind of gods that demanded human sacrifices. There was an article a few years ago about bog bodies. Bodies, the remains of bodies, found in swamps of Ireland, in bogs. And they were actually remarkably well preserved. Archaeologists have been able to study them and conclude that a lot of these were human sacrifices. Sacrifices to the gods of the Irish. Now, gods that demand human sacrifices are not very friendly gods. They're not gods you want to be worshiping if you can help it. And so the Irish were committing human sacrifices, maybe not on the level of the Aztecs, but on a serious scale. Prisoners of war were sacrificed, adults were sacrificed, infants were sacrificed. The Irish gods were just that kind of gods, and it took blood to take away the gods' wrath. Part of Patrick's genius was to end two things in Ireland. He ended slavery, and he ended human sacrifice. See, Patrick explains to them this is an example of accommodation, of trying to relate Christianity to people's beliefs. He says you don't need to do human sacrifice anymore because there's that guy, Jesus Christ, who was actually God, the Son of God. He was the last sacrifice. And because he was actually the Son of God, that was such a big sacrifice. It took away the need to do any other sacrifices ever again. And the Irish actually really liked this idea because it's not like they liked sacrificing lots of people. And so that was a major accomplishment. The Irish realized that, wait, if we believe in this kind of God, if this is the kind of God we have, then we don't have to do human sacrifices anymore. So this is an example of Patrick using the technique of persuasion, but also the technique of accommodation, relating Christianity to Irish belief. At the same time, one of the things he manages to get rid of, he also manages to get rid of slavery in Ireland. Again, you can kind of understand how that would have been personal to him, having spent 6 years as a slave. And so that was another major accomplishment. And finally, in this section, Patrick starts something else in Ireland. He starts Irish monasticism. And so what I want to talk about for a few minutes now is monasticism. Monasticism refers to the development of monks, the idea of a group of religious men or women living together in a community. So it's a community dedicated to a religious purpose. Now, monasticism did not begin in Ireland. It actually begins in Egypt over 100 years ago, but it really takes off in Ireland. Around 313, think back again to Constantine. Constantine legalizes Christianity. Now, that was great for the early Christians. Now you don't have to worry about being killed or thrown to the lions, but it also means the age of martyrs seems like it's ending. And remember, martyrs, like people who believed so much in their faith they were willing to die for it, well, I mean, they were seen as the heroes of the faith. This was like the best way to live a heroic Christianity. Well, what do you do now when people aren't killing you for being a Christian? Like, how do you live awesome, heroic Christianity in a time when no one's willing to kill you for it anymore? So this was an example of the red martyrdom, red for blood, right? So the red martyrdom is people killing you for your beliefs. Well, what happens is some Christians develop an idea of a different kind of martyrdom. They develop the idea of a white martyrdom. This is white because, you're not dying, but it's still sacrifice, and a major sacrifice. So in the white martyrdom, you go off to the desert, right? It starts in Egypt. And you go off into the desert alone. You master the body. You do without the luxuries of life. You fast, you live in isolation, and you essentially become a hermit. You do without all of the comforts of civilization. The desert is a place where you can see clearly, away from the distractions of civilization. It's also seen as a place of heroic self-sacrifice. So this is a way to be a heroic, amazing Christian when you can't die for your belief. This is called the white martyrdom. Again, the red martyrdom is people killing you for your belief. The white martyrdom is heroic self-sacrifice, going into the desert and becoming a hermit. Now, this begins with individuals going out into the desert by themselves. But as they do this, people hear about them, they like them, they get a reputation, they want to join them, so they get followers, and suddenly you have a small community of monks living together. And this is where monasticism comes from. Monasticism, the idea of a group of religious men or women living together and living a life of heroic self-denial, doing without all of the comforts of life. Patrick tells the Irish about this, and they actually love the idea. Many of the Irish are like, okay, now we're Christians, we can't really go around killing each other, what do we do? Well, one of the things they can do is they become hermits. So they go off out in the middle of nowhere, they live alone, they fast heroically, even in very extreme ways, and they attract followers, and monasteries grow up. And so you have in Ireland these Irish monks, these communities of religious men and eventually of women. Now these monasteries become centers of prayer, right? That's their first job. They're supposed to be religious, but not only prayer. They also become centers of learning. Study actually becomes seen as something holy. Like studying is not just something that makes you smarter, it's something that makes you a better person. They have a lot of interest in the Greek and Roman classics, in the stories of ancient Greece and Rome, in their philosophy, in their literature, and they read them. They read the Bible, but they read these other books too. And not only do they read these ancient Greek and Roman books, they copy them. This is almost the only thing that saves some of these books from being lost. So when the Irish start copying these ancient Greek and Roman books, sometimes this is the only reason they've saved them for us. These Irish Christian monks copying books, seeing this as like a religious duty, they develop libraries that keep learning alive in the Dark Ages. And so remember, there are no other schools or universities. These monasteries really become, in a sense, the only thing that saves civilization. There's a famous book by Thomas Cahill. It's called How the Irish Saved Civilization. It's a good book, very easy to read. And what Thomas Cahill says is, it was these Irish Christian monks who, copying book after book, who built these monasteries, who built up libraries, who saved the ancient works and ancient learning from being lost, who were a kind of light in the Dark Ages, kind of a big deal. And so often the only reason we have those ancient books is because they survive in a manuscript that was copied by an Irish monk. Finally, there's one more heroic thing the Irish can do. And that heroic thing the Irish can do is the last kind of martyrdom. So the red martyrdom was being killed for the faith. That's not happening much anymore. There's the white martyrdom. See, the Irish were actually really disappointed to learn that nobody was going to kill them for being Christian, but they had to deal with it. Then there's the white martyrdom, which is you go off, you live as a monk, you do heroic self-sacrifice, you give up a lot of the comforts, we would say, that make life worthwhile. So it was a kind of heroic self-sacrifice. Yeah, you couldn't literally sacrifice your life, but you kind of could by giving up a lot of the things that we would say make life worthwhile. There was one more kind of martyrdom. I've heard it called the hardest thing for an Irishman to do, to leave Ireland. Many Irish monks take this last kind of martyrdom. They leave Ireland forever, many of them. And they leave Ireland, setting out for Europe to try to spread Christianity to the Germanic tribes who invaded the Roman Empire. And this is seen as a heroic feat that is actually worthy of Irish warriors, because they can't fight and kill each other. But hey, to leave Ireland forever, to go into exile, to go among the pagans who actually might, if they were lucky, kill them for being Christian, this is seen as something really heroic and worthy of a solid Irish fighter. One of these was named Columbanus, a really, really hardcore Irish monk. Columbanus went to what is today France, then it was Gaul. He went to the court of the Merovingians, where Clovis was. There, the Irish monks built monasteries, and these monasteries became centers of learning and centers of Christianity. They copied books, they illustrated manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts, one of the most famous of them is the Book of Kells. The illustrations in this are absolutely intricate. So it's not just valuable for the words that are written down, but for the incredibly beautiful art that these monks did. The amount of effort they put into this is really incredible. And this Book of Kells is seen as one of the greatest examples, not just of learning, but actually of art from this time period. Well worth taking a look at. There's a famous poem, of course, by one of these monks, because, of course, as they're copying these manuscripts, they're human. They get bored, right? They get bored doing their homework. They didn't have, Insta Chat, Snapgram, whatever the kids call it nowadays, to go on to waste time. So they would doodle in the manuscripts. And some of these doodlings are quite fascinating. We found one manuscript recently. They would write notes in the margins, little doodles in the margins. And so there's one manuscript that we found that had kind of a stain on it. We weren't sure what it was until we translated the note the monk left. He said, "This is where the cat pissed on the manuscript." The monks obviously kept cats because mice were a problem. And, cats, they want attention. And so cats can get actually really mad at you if you're not giving them attention when they want it. Well, apparently this cat felt that the monk was paying too much attention to his manuscript and not enough attention to him. There's another one in another manuscript where the monk, again, got bored, started doodling, and apparently his mind drifted until he saw his pet cat hunting mice. And he kind of started reflecting, man, my cat and I, we're a lot alike. He's hunting mice, I'm hunting words, we're both getting wisdom. He's doing his trade, I'm doing my trade. And so this is the poem, Pangurban. I and Pangurban, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at. Hunting mice is his delight, hunting words I sit at night. 'Tis a merry thing to see, how glad at our tasks are we. Pangurban, my cat and I, in our arts we find our bliss. I have mine and he has his. Goes on later in the poem. I get wisdom day and night, turning darkness into light. That's really interesting because these monks saw their task as a really high and important one. By copying books, they were turning darkness into light. They were bringing light to the world of the Dark Ages. So they knew exactly what they were doing. So in this short section, we've covered a lot of different things. We've talked about the early German warriors, about early German warrior culture, the warrior culture of Beowulf. It was macho, it was warlike. If there's such a thing as toxic masculinity, it was toxic masculinity. We've talked about the slow road of the conversion of the German warriors to Christianity, starting with Clovis as an example. We've talked about methods of conversion. You could try persuasion, you could try force, you could try accommodation. We've used more specific examples of St. Patrick going to Ireland and attempting to convert the Irish, And we've talked about the different kinds of martyrdom. The red martyrdom, where you died for the faith, but also the white martyrdom, where no one would kill you for the faith, but you still kind of sacrificed your life by going off into the desert alone to live this life of heroic self-sacrifice. And finally, the other kind of martyrdom, where the Irish monks, again, monks were communities of religious men and women. In this case, mostly men were the ones going out and doing the travel. They would leave Ireland and they would travel throughout Europe trying to convert these German warriors to Christianity. And their monasteries, the religious communities they built, became centers, yes, of prayer, but also of learning. And it was that learning that they saw brought light to the Dark Ages. Next unit, we'll continue learning about the early Middle Ages.